Hi everyone, today we are going to build a PC that's able to play the first 5 Need for Speed games. Since they were released between 94 and 2000, we will settle on a 1999 PC. For this we will choose a Slot A build. And let's start with the CPU. There was a period 20 years ago when CPUs looked like this. They are still regular CPUs, but for some reason Intel and AMD placed them on a little board that slotted in a specific port onto the motherboard. This is the AMD K7 CPU that runs at 550 MHz. That's 10 times slower than the CPUs we have now, and it has just one core like all CPUs had back then. The motherboard is the Asus K7M that, except for the CPU slot, it looks exactly like any other ATX motherboard. To the right of the CPU, there are 3 slots for SDRAM memory modules. We have 2 IDEs. That was the standard connector for consumer hard drives 20 years ago. We also have a floppy connector. South of the CPU, there's the AGP2X slot that was a very fast PCI slot, and it was used exclusively for graphics cards. There are also 5 PCI slots that can be used for various extension boards like sound or capture cards, additional USBs, and many others. Towards the bottom of the board, there's an even slower slot called ISA that can also accommodate extension boards, but even older ones. By the turn of the century, they were phased out from the consumer motherboards. In the backplate area, we can probably recognize a few connectors. Keyboards and mice didn't always come with an USB connector, and these are called the PS2 connectors. We can also see 2 worn-out USBs, the 1.1 standard. Next we have parallel and 2 serial ports that can accommodate printers and mice or other devices. Next we have the audio area, where we have 3 jack connectors and something called a game port that historically was associated with the audio card because of the DOS days. We will use a Riva TNT made by Diamond that was released in 1998. This connects to the motherboard through the AGP2X connector and outputs to a VGA port. Since we have so many PCI slots, it would be a shame not to use them, so we will throw in 2 additional graphics cards. This is the 3DFX Voodoo2, also made by Diamond, but it was released 1 year earlier in 1998, and was still very relevant in 99, especially when used in pairs. This is a special kind of graphics card that is only able to do games, and unfortunately forces the users to add complexity to their PC builds, as they require a separate graphics card that is able to handle 2D or what the operating system displays. Next we have the hard drive, the Quantum Fireball, that has 10 GB capacity. For sound I would have chosen the Sound Blaster Live, but since the first game has a DOS version, I chose the AWE64 Gold for this project. Now let's assemble our 99 PC. We fit the motherboard onto the bench table. I'm using a bench table rather than a PC case because I don't have the space to store the computer cases, and also it's easier to debug. The memory module is next, and we are using a 64 MB module that should be more than enough for Windows and the first 5 iterations of Need for Speed, and I think that it stays true to the regular capacity computers had back then. The CPU is next, and the 550 MHz Athlon fits easily into the dedicated slot. The 20-pin power connector somehow gets in the way, but we manage to squeeze it between the CPU and the RAM. The Riva TNT is next, and this one has its graphics chip made by NVIDIA. You may have noticed that they haven't started naming their products GeForce yet. One of the 3DFX cards gets fitted 2 slots lower than the graphics card, and the second one is placed in the next slot. The Voodoo2s employ some smart technology, allowing them to work together to render a frame, but they need to synchronize, and this is done with the help of the rainbow-colored cable. The last addition to our build is the sound card, that uses the last slot on the motherboard, the ISA slot. And now let's fire up the games. We start with Road and Track: The Need for Speed. The first version was released for DOS in 1994, and in 1996 a Windows version was released. In both cases, 3DFX didn't have any graphics card on the market, and we can only look at the game playing in software mode only. Also, the replays are not compatible, so you may notice some difference between the two screens.
Final lap.
The second game in the series was launched in 1997, and this time the developers could harness some of the graphical goodies that came with a 3DFX, but it's clear that game companies were only learning how to approach the Glide API for their games 1 year after its launch. For Need for Speed 2, we can see all sorts of particles added to the environment, but overall I would say it's debatable which mode looks better.
lap.
Starting with the third iteration of the series, we can really see the magic at work. And while the software mode brings some improvements over the previous game, the 3DFX screen almost looks like a modern game at a low resolution, although a bit dark, which I didn't notice when I made the capture.
final lap. You beat the lap record. Final lap. Lap record. You've won the race.
Need for Speed High Stakes is the fourth game in the franchise, and this time the difference between softer mode and 3DFX is even more noticeable.
final lap. That's your best lap. You placed first.
The last game we are looking at today is Need for Speed Porsche, and this time we can take advantage of another renderer, the Direct 3D that uses DirectX 7, where Riva TNT gets closer to the Voodoo, but we can still enjoy some graphical goodies and a better frame rate from that SLI powerhouse. This shows that a few years later, the competition is slowly beginning to creep up to the 3DFX, but still the Voodoo reigns supreme. Today's side quest looks at the evolution of the dashboard throughout the first 5 Need for Speed games, a feature that is not always available when using a 3DFX Voodoo. Using Voodoo2s adds complexity to our build, but we also added some special kind of magic to our system. We got a glimpse of the future, as other graphic cards will take another 2 years to catch up. I really enjoyed this project and wanted to keep this build around for more games, but a new project awaits us. Before leaving this one, there's an interesting thing I noticed about the components. Almost every computer part that has some sort of capacity has increased by 1,000 times now, compared to our 23 years old computer. Thank you for watching and see you next time.